It's my delight and pleasure to introduce a couple of new friends. Professor Julian Stern from York St John University. Julian, you'll have to tell people what your title is now, because it's some kind of grand sort of galaxy-spanning thing to do with education and spirituality. I can't even remember what it is, but it sounds very important. I went to meet Julian. I felt very intimidated by all the books on his shelves. I wanted to take them all home. He kept pulling them off and going, I wrote this one, and I wrote this one, and I wrote this one. He knew I was going to tease him a little bit. And Rachael Shillitoe as well. So the two of them are going to present their interim report, which we have been waiting with bated breath for. So without further ado, I hand over to you two. Why don't we give them a little splattering of applause?
Oh.
There we go.
That's all for you.
Just in case we don't feel like giving one afterwards.
Thank you. Yeah, get that done first.
Do you want this?
Yes, can you hear me? I've got me this mic on. Hello. Oh, you're close. Lovely to see you all. No, I'm not going to. He's already done all the books I've written, so I won't do that to introduce myself. I'm Julian Stern, work at York St John University, and I'm a teacher. That's me. That's my identity. It's interesting as a conference, and I was so pleased already this morning, and sometimes new colleagues in university get worried about presenting at conferences, and I say the point about a conference is to confer. You are not there to tell the truth from on high and to a lovely, sorry, it is a lovely audience, and we will tell you lots of truths, but that's not the point, it's to confer. So we are very much wanting your views, both in this talk, in the workshop we're doing this afternoon, and after, and if not forever, then for a long time. So welcome. We are, oh yes, is that, how is that working? Ah. Oh, it is, yeah, that's me. Oh, good. Yes, I'm just checking. I can't work out his technology. That's why we printed off all of these things. And by the way, can I say, if you want to, we're doing some quotations in there. If you want to follow them, obviously you can follow them on paper. If we don't read them out correctly, we're certainly reading them out. Rachael and I worked out. They are direct quotations, so they're a bit lumpy quotations and hesitating. So you will excuse us for those. You may not excuse us when we're doing our talking, which is also lumpy, hesitating, and slightly incoherent. But at least when we're quoting, we mean to do that. So I'm Julian Stern, this is Rachael Shillitoe, whom I first met in Chicago. That's the life of academics, isn't it, Rachael?
Well, yeah, not in the main. That was
occasionally.
Always jetted about.
We met in Chicago, which I thought I'd just say that last year. Phil asked us, next Saturday, Phil, is the 18-month anniversary of Lat Blaylock. Do any of you know Lat Blaylock? Of Lat Blaylock emailing you and me saying, can I introduce you to? I think you might enjoy. So next weekend, 18 months ago, we met to ask questions about, as it shows on there, prayer spaces in schools. I did a wonderful seminar with other colleagues on silence, serenity, and solitude. It's a lovely, just the title, I want to do silence, serenity, and I was doing solitude and my colleague was doing silence, and she went up to the mic and said, hello, I'm Helen Lees. And several people further back in the room said, no, it's okay, you can carry on talking. I said, yes, I was doing silence, thank you very much. So anyway, this is the contemplative bit. So trying to work out how prayer spaces in schools works, to evaluate it. And we spent an awful long time initially, before Rachael was on board, trying to work out what could be evaluated. And for those, any of you who've done research, and many people have done as in students and so on, it is not easy. I have been doing research for a long time, and it is still not easy. Indeed, once you find it easy, you're doing it wrong. Once research tells you what you're expecting to find out, you're doing it wrong. The only decent research is research that hits you in the face now and again, like a wet kipper, and says, no, you're wrong, we're not going to tell you what you want us to tell you. I would say the same for all classes in all schools. Martin Buber says the test of any lesson, real lesson as opposed to mere instruction, is that it should take place in a series of mutual surprises. So please, surprise me. What we worked on eventually is to evaluate it according to relational spirituality, according to the contribution of the work of prayer spaces in schools, work in schools, to children's spiritual development. And the idea of spiritual development that we worked on were, as it says up there and as it says in the handout, four dimensions of spiritual development. And this must be right because Ofsted once said it. So there's a few Ofsted jokes, come on. Ofsted aren't in charge of spirituality overall, but they do inspect it. Relationship to self, relationship to other people, relationship to the world, by which we mean both the world as a whole, nature, the universe, but also non-human animals and other objects, manufacturers' objects, and so on. And relationship, and for many of the children, of course, relationship to the divine and sacred. So what we did was look at all of that stuff to try and work out what was happening. Rachel. We tried to get, that was one of the ones that bit us, because originally we'd had divine beings, and we thought, no, some are talking about sacredness, some are talking about holiness, and not to do with beings, but about... So we ended up agreeing that the category was better described, because in some documents it's described as God. And God does come up, but we wanted a category that didn't presume it was only God, but included the sacred.
Yeah, and sort of that's stretched across religious and non-religious dimensions. So when we're using terms like the sacred and the divine, it both is in relation to religious and non-religious meanings in that way.
So what did we do, Rachel?
Well, sure.
I'm sure there will be loads of questions. Can we hold our questions, because there will be plenty of time at the end of this and in the workshop a little bit later, because I don't want to derail your presentation. Is that okay? Make a note of questions and then we will have some time for that.
Yeah, so to investigate and explore how prayer spaces in schools develops children and young people's spirituality, we used two research tools. We at first offered a questionnaire to all pupils involved in prayer spaces in schools during 2016 to 2017. So in total, we managed to get responses from 555 pupils, which is quite a lot in terms of research and data gathered. And this spanned across pupils aged 7 to 16, across 24 schools in England. And the pupils that we sampled, in the main, broadly reflected the demographics of the country as a whole in terms of religious and non-religious identity. So how many identifying as Christian and Muslim and non-religious. And in addition to this, we then followed up with a second research tool, which was going into schools and conducting interviews with both pupils and teachers. And so in total, this involved 86 respondents, 71 pupils, 15 staff, across 7 schools, both in the north and in the south. And again, of this sample, there was a broad range of respondents identifying as religious and non-religious.
Different religions. So this report that you've got is an interim report. That doesn't mean, well, it does mean it's only half done. It is interim, it's genuinely interim, and we would like you, we will ask you later, we'd like you to be involved in making it better, fuller, and so on. And it's based on the questionnaires, although we haven't actually presented much about the questionnaires specifically in this report. We'll do more quantitative work on that later. And the interviews, and we've only worked on about half of the transcripts of interviews. We've only got about half of the transcripts are still being done, takes a long time. So we've got another half to do, where we'll try and apply what we think we found out to the new stuff and see if that works, which is a good way to do research. So we'll go through those 4 aspects of spiritual development one by one and explain a little about it, but mostly quote what children and adults have said about it. As we said earlier, if we speak badly, we do speak badly now and again. I speak badly, sorry. I speak badly. You can follow it on paper. You can follow it up afterwards as well. So we'll start with relationships with the self. Phew, that's it. And it's worth saying that reflection, and if we call it reflection, because that's relationship to self is like a mirror, holding up a mirror, reflection involves, in the first sense, being conscious of oneself. And there are people, philosophers and other people, who would say not just human beings are self-conscious in some sense, have a sense of themselves, but that's important. But that particularly human beings have a way of what Hannah Arendt describes as duality, of doubling themselves, of actually thinking about themselves as though, well, we all do it, don't we? We sort of have a little voice that criticizes us. And it takes us a while often to realize we're the ones doing the criticism as well as being criticized, if you know what I mean. So we split ourselves in order to judge ourselves, sometimes well, sometimes badly. So a duality, asking and answering questions. But reflection or self or being with the self may also involve, this is one of my favorite words in the world, developing ecstasy. And if you don't know ecstasy, it's a lovely word. I'm trying to get it in the dictionary. It's not in the dictionary yet. I mean, it's a word. I didn't make it up. Ecstasy means to go out of yourself. Stasis, out of a place. That's what the word means, to be off your head in drug terms, I believe, young people. And ecstasy, ecstatic experiences in religious senses, going beyond yourself, transcendence. Ecstasy means being within yourself, being comfortable within yourself. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita, like a tortoise withdrawing into its shell. I actually thought when I read that, did they have tortoises then? But anyway, if there's a biologist in the house, can you tell me afterwards? When were tortoises invented? Relationships with the self. So, sorry, I've got to move this thing, haven't I? So can we have some examples of experiences of the self? Thank goodness Rachael was going to say something now.
So
I said we were going to be confused.
So this is from a student.
Yeah.
I was feeling like I had some ants in my body, and after my body was relaxing, and it felt like I was falling, but I wasn't.
That's a lovely feeling, like I had some ants in my body. I think is a gorgeous physical description of the experience. So, but an adult talked about this as well.
Having just the chance just to sit there and reflect on your own thoughts and feelings, I thought it was really good, and that's why all these comments have come through. It gave them a chance to just be introspective, whereas I don't think they would normally be at home either playing on Xbox, doing homework, or doing some form of chores. They just don't get much. And also, it's quite meditative, almost essentially like a form of meditation, which I thought was really good because I'm quite big into meditation and how good it is for your well-being, just taking 10 minutes out of the day to relax and kind of breathe and think about the things. I think that definitely helped with that.
And a student said as well.
We normally went around in pairs or in a group, but I think it would be nice if we added an activity where it was just by ourselves and we could just sit and relax.
Yeah. So that sense of just being with yourself. But some talked about the reflective self, the duality of the self, the judging yourself. A student said.
I can't quite remember what it was called, but it had lots of mirrors and it was asking us questions about ourselves and what we thought of ourselves, and I think that helped a lot of people, and it helped me because it made you think of the good things about you, not just because a lot of the time you think about what's bad about you and what's good about other people, but it helps you think about what's good about yourself.
And which is important. And another one said,
like in the day, what might happen and feel like feeling happy or like sad, you just sit there and think. The interview said when you're thinking about, is it a conversation that you're having with yourself? Is it just your thoughts in your head? The student responded, I think it's like a conversation that you're having with yourself because it's sort of saying one thing in one half of your mind and you're saying it again in the other half, which I quite like. And the interviewer responded, sure. And afterwards, how did you feel about it? How do you feel it is? And the student explained, I feel much more relaxed about everything, yes. Just sort of.
And a lovely description by a student of having a conversation between one half of their brain and the other. And it helps them relax. This self-reflection also involves, and several people talked about, de-stressing, not distressing, de-stressing oneself. So an adult talked about this.
There are concerns for GCSEs, which when you're dealing with year 7 and year 8, you shouldn't be worrying about your GCSEs, but it's obviously something that's already in their minds.
And a student said, to back that up,
It's quite stressful school sometimes, so I thought that it was really relaxing, and it kind of helped me think about things that are more important than what I have been worrying about, and it helps you focus on the right things that I need to do to become like a better person.
as well as de-stressing, there was a stress, as it were, on guilt specifically. So one student talked about the fizzy, what's it?
So there was one that like you got a tablet and you put it in water and it fizzed, and then it like got rid of all your sins or something. But yes, in the interview asked, and why did you like that? And the student responded, well, I don't really know, because it was like the sins like just go away, and it's just, I don't know, it's just sort of made me feel lighter, because I knew like all my bad things disappeared, like not disappeared, like they've gone in that sort of way. So yeah.
Yeah, and there are examples of simple ecstasy, what I would call ecstasy, and this is my favourite one.
One student, I quite liked when you sat on the sofa and just relaxed and thought about just, well, what? Another student said, nothing. And the other student said, yeah.
Beautiful. I couldn't do a better description, other than the tortoise, better description. But as well as this self-reflective, some of the self-reflection was, they described it as getting ready to do something more. So there's an adult talks about that.
There were a couple of activities like that. The ones where they were supposed to just sit and reflect silently, they found that very difficult. And there were some tents where they had to go inside and just sit and be calm and quiet. And of course, at that age, they just wanted to play and in the tents and make up games. But some of the activities, like the worry one and the one where you had to come up with a real big, deep questions, it was startling what questions they came up with. And you know how the interviewer asked, how big of questions did they? And the adult responded, yes, it surprises you, doesn't it? I think it's, and another adult said, yes, for the children, they're so young. And the interview asked, well, sorry, what sorts of questions? And the other adult said, well, questions about God, weren't they? And the existence, really thought quite deeply. Not everybody, some of the questions that were there were quite trivial, but there were some very deep sort of questions, about why does God let this happen?
And can I stress, I'm using a lot of stress today, can I stress how the teachers, mostly teachers and teaching assistants we interviewed, the teachers learned from the children's experience. The teachers realised from the prayer space how stressed their kids were, even in year 7 and 8 about GCSEs. They learnt how the children had deep thoughts, could think deeply. There's part of me is desperately sad that it has to be a prayer space in school that goes into school for the teachers to realise that their children have deep thoughts and are stressed by GCSEs, even in year 7 and 8. But hey, if it's working, and I'm absolutely delighted, thrilled that is a way. So the learning of the teachers involved, including not the teachers actually doing the stuff, but meeting the kids when they come back to class, is absolutely crucial and is one of the contributions that we weren't evaluating but does come out. So, Rachel, do you want to take us through relationships with other people?
Yeah, so in terms of the second category of relationships, it was relationships with other people. And one of the strong themes that emerged was actually relationships or thinking about or reflecting on deceased relatives or pets. And these findings actually support some other research done by another sociologist of religion, Abby Day, who, when researching young people's beliefs, especially those young people who identified as atheist, would often talk to and think about relatives who have passed away and may have thought about them in terms of being in heaven or being somewhere else, and often said that they prefer to do this rather than praying to or talking to God. And so relationships with dead relatives were often described in these comments. For example, one adult said,
I sort of noticed the children doing like they talk about lost family members up in heaven. It's a time to reflect. A few got quite upset, actually, I remember, because they were thinking about sort of loved ones that passed recently, especially kind of, as I say, my favourite bit that was most reflective bit with the bubbles, because it was a quiet space where they all sat down. It was dark and you could just kind of reflect. And I think it was a common theme, sort of praying for loved ones who'd passed on.
Whereas a student reflected.
I thought about people who I've lost who are in heaven, because it's like a time to reflect on them. And I don't really do it when I'm at home, because it's like I'm so busy doing other things. And I don't really have time to think. I think about them, but how would I when you have a space to do it?
It wasn't only thinking about people that mattered, though. Mending relationships with others, so forgiveness, saying sorry, was a really strong theme. One student said,
I was missing my grandma because she died, and I was making peace with one of my friends because we shouted at each other.
An adult reflected that.
I think it was because they realised that they could forgive, and it was making the decision they were going to forgive someone and let go.
Several of our respondents also reflected on the idea of prayer space being a way to generate cohesion or foster a sense of community with others through relationships or, through improving our own self-image. One adult reflected that.
It's really amazing. Maybe I'll just do one of these. It's really amazing. It really unites people as well. And even those that aren't Christians come and look at the space and actually go up at break time or maybe lunchtime and actually see what we're doing. But it does definitely, even amongst the staff, it definitely sparks, conversations. And people were questioning things, which is brilliant. Thank you for that, teacher. Questioning things is good in schools. Why isn't it happening every single moment of the day? But hey, it is doing.
And in terms of thinking about our relationships with others, many of the respondents talked about this in terms of care and compassion. And with the first comment about actively caring and the subsequent ones more being about the compassion that was generated by reflection. One student said,
I personally think the little love hearts are the best. I've got one in my pocket because it shows somebody, if they need it, that they have someone to go to, that they have someone that they can trust, that actually cares about them. Because I think a lot in secondary, there's a lot of, they gather a lot of emotions and they gather a lot of stress. And knowing there's someone they can go to and that someone cares about them is better than knowing that teachers care about them and having friends.
And in terms of that care and compassion, it also extended to individuals and communities in other parts of the world and developing that sense of empathy, with one student reflecting on this saying...
well, an adult talks about there's lots of Donald Trump prayers going on, sadly. And an adult talking about, some of them were about other things like the world around us. And I feel like there should be more activities like that. Because as well as knowing yourself, you should have knowledge of what's around you and what's happening in the world. Shall we stop there? So the third category was relationships with the world, which can include the world as a whole, nature, non-human animals, objects, and so on. Non-human animals were frequently mentioned, notwithstanding the scepticism of the first of these children, who said,
I don't think you would really think about cats whilst trying to look at something spiritual.
They've not been on the internet, have they? Obviously. But another student, lots of them did talk about them, another student said, what were you thinking about?
My dog and my rabbit died 5 years ago, but I still love them.
It's 5 years ago, so as a primary pupil, still remembering their rabbit that died 5 years ago. It's a rabbit, actually, as you will see. But still, it was dead. I'm wondering, is someone's going to tell me, after they tell me about the tortoises, is there such a thing as a rabbit? Cross between a rabbit and a radish, I guess. I don't know. But it died 5 years ago. So someone else talked about. I'm trying to prevent Rachel from being able to read out loud now.
Thank you.
Rachel.
Thanks. I was wondering about saving the world, saving animals and dog, cat.
And isn't that lovely? Saving the world and saving a dog and a cat. And younger children particularly, but older children too. It's that swap from the tiny little thing to the big things. And adults talked about this as well.
I recognise the questioning ones, and like the one about the pet you don't get. You do get that sort of thing, but they are children, and there will be a children's perspective on things.
Yeah, and a student had seen a response from someone else about a cat, but said,
instead of an old cat, it's my old hamster, who I just thought about because he was a really sweet, really, really sweet hamster, and he'd been through quite a few things that probably shouldn't have happened. So I accidentally dropped him down the stairs once, and he didn't break anything, but he managed to survive and still be strong, which I found was really amazing. Poor hamster.
if any of you RE specialists who have seen the video Eggshells and Thunderbolts, my friend John Logan was on that, because a lot of primary school RE they did implicit religion, and he was talking about it on the television programme, the video, as it became, saying, and they look after the hamster in the room, and they call that RE. He went on to say, at least if the hamster died, they could do some good RE. And for the rest of his career, people have been going up to him saying, oh, John, how's the hamster doing? Is it still alive? But it is some good RE. So, food was used in a number of activities. For example, a student said,
I thought how delicious the bread was.
Thank you. And it is mentioned a lot. I did some loneliness research, and one child said, food stops me being lonely. To explain, pesto pasta is my favourite. That makes me happy. If you ever want, have we got pesto pasta for lunch? Nature as well. So a student talked about nature.
You could do it outside. Say it was a nice day, you could go outside and just be with the trees and the birds and the animals.
Another student said.
Like natural music, like music taken from nature.
Music like the wind?
Yeah, so water and birds.
Why would you like that?
It might calm people down.
Yeah. So the physicality, and we started off with the ants, feeling like you got ants. The physicality of the participants was occasionally mentioned, and an adult talked about this.
I've had comments and remarks from my RE class. Oh, why are we learning about stories again? This is boring, blah. This is actually something almost like a kinesthetic learning. Children doing things. This is actually doing something. They had a task to do, and I think that really resonated really well with them because it allowed them to do something a bit different and really kind of engage with religion a lot more than they were able to do just in a normal lesson in the classroom. It's definitely something which I would happily do with them more often on a regular basis. I think especially the lower years, it was really good. I really liked it.
And incidentally, whatever adults think about children and their phones and their possessions and their clothes and their trainers, no one, out of 555 people, no one mentioned a physical, manufactured, sort of personally owned possession. Which encouraging, I think, but also a good surprise. So relationships with the world. Moving on to the last category, relationships with the sacred and divine.
Yeah, so as we just mentioned earlier on, when we're talking about the sacred and the divine, we're both meaning God, gods, beings, places, spaces. Again, that cross that religious, spiritual, and non-religious dimension. And so mentions of the sacred and divine or gods were common, but they didn't really dominate in either of the questionnaire responses or the interviews. And many people might have assumed that the activities supported by prayer space in schools, would be dominated by, prayers to a transcendent God. And it was mentioned, but rarely. For example, one adult said,
the one with the coloured bubbles floating up, and they float to the top, and the symbolism was that you put the kind of prayer on the bubble, and it kind of floats up to God.
And in terms of that relationship with God, what was mentioned was an active and timely relationship, expecting God to be actually doing something. One student reflected.
It's like you're not necessarily putting your hands together and praying normally. You find different ways to show that you're talking to God, a bit like more active ways of doing it. So it's not necessarily just sitting in your room all night and praying before you go to bed. It's basically, if you need it in school, it's there for you.
And another student reflected that.
I prayed about God bringing my cat back.
And quite often it was simply mentioned as, taking time, having that time to speak or pray to God. One adult reflected.
Some say they like being less stressed. I can definitely relate to that. On the beanbag's nice to take some time, 5 minutes out of the day to reflect on what to communicate with God. Some pray for things. Sometimes you're just so busy you don't get a chance to think about.
In addition to this, when respondents were talking about communicating to God, this was a communicative relationship, one that involved both speaking and listening, but also had very much a sense of the mundane, the everyday, the conversational, a chatty God. So one adult reflected.
I'll just do one of these. Maybe I've definitely heard that they can actually sit still and they feel they can speak to God, and that maybe he's listening.
And some talked about encountering God in a different way, with one adult saying,
they were struck, lost for words. Thank you very much. I think it's a really good experience overall, because it just took sort of a lesson out, what was normally a teacher-led RE lesson, just to enable you to go for them to see God from a different perspective almost, see prayer and religion from a different perspective.
And one particularly interesting theme was how God was religiously identified, with one adult discussing about taking Jesus out of the equation. The interviewer said, is there a mention of Jesus or God in the materials or something else?
It used to be, yes. It's very much like Jesus, but it's really evolved. I mean, we talk about prayer, we talk about thought, about spirituality, but not this is Christian. It might say, ask God a question. If you could write to God, what would your letter be? But it's not overtly Christian.
And some of the students, use the time to ask those sort of bigger existential questions, particularly in relation to God's existence. One student said,
when they're there, it's all about God. Not all about God, but it's about, to me, it's about your beliefs. And you question, is God really or not?
And a relatively small number described other aspects of the sacred or the divine, including one comment on holiness more generally.
I quite like the part where you took your shoes off and you went in, you felt you were stepping in somewhere which you wouldn't normally be like when you step into church. It was like that feeling, and holy, like you're stepping on holy ground. Now, there was a whole set of other issues which we will not do much on, and we have been and still are researching the impact of these activities on children's spiritual development, but we couldn't help ourselves in noticing some other general themes including issues on policy and practice, the issues that people have talked about, the controversies, the worries that people have. John Hull, the great Australian John Hull, theologian and RE specialist, talked about how he couldn't understand the law requiring collective worship in schools and said it should be replaced by a law requiring collective spirituality. Interestingly, I think this activity, prayer spaces, fulfills that in a way that collective worship or assembly typically doesn't. In other words, if you were to have compulsory collective spirituality, then it might actually be achieved through the sort of activities in prayer spaces. There were all sorts of statutory issues. Some of the adults involved liked prayer spaces in schools because it precisely wasn't that statutory thing. It wasn't statutory RE, it wasn't statutory worship. There was some voluntariness about it on the pupils' behalf and the teachers' behalf, some more voluntariness, some informality about it, and that was important. But there are controversial issues, and none of us, I think, would want to duck them. They must be tackled, which doesn't mean they must be resolved. They may not be able to be fully resolved, but they should, I would say, they should be tackled. A second issue, general issue, is parents. I had some parents on the phone to me. Luckily, for the last few months, my phone wasn't working. But my phone number was given to parents to give consent to their children taking part. But parents were concerned, several parents, with the research, but actually with the prayer spaces. So they might ring me up and say, why should my daughter take part in this? She's not religious. And I said, well, this is research on what they're doing. Ask the school if you're worried about her taking part in the research, and about the ethics of the research and the ethics of the prayer spaces. And there were parents who were concerned, understandably, about that. And it's worth mentioning that as a research issue as well. A third and final one, Rachael, is about religious and non-religious self-identification.
Yeah, so with both phases of the research, we would ask our respondents how they identified either religiously or non-religiously, and gave them a range of categories or identities to choose from. And it was just, again, interesting reflecting on the diversity and the highly nuanced nature of this. So, you know, we had people saying atheist, agnostic, Christian. It was also interesting with the questionnaires to actually see when respondents had crossed it out and put something else, or maybe crossed it out and just left it blank. We've put a range of them in the report, but I'm just going to highlight some of the ones that stood out to me. For example, I don't know whether to believe it or not. I was baptised a Christian, but gradually morphed into a humanist or agnostic. I like the idea of morphing. Catholic, because I was baptised, but I don't believe in God or any God. In the middle of believing in God and not believing. Jewish by blood, atheist by belief, strong Catholic. And so I think this really sort of reflects the uncertainty, the ambiguity, the potentially anxiety around how to identify religiously or non-religiously, and the considerable middle ground that is there. And I think this really attends nicely as well to children and young people's agency, in that when they're presented with these categories, yes, they might choose one, but they'll justify it, they'll caveat it, and they want to highlight that tension, that ambiguity, that uncertainty, and you know, the fluid nature of identity.
My favourite one is don't know yet. And I've never seen that before, and I think it's a gorgeous thing to say, don't know yet. In other words, they're realising they are on a progression, and how healthy that is. Much more healthy than just don't know, or do know, but don't know yet, and still working on that. So our conclusions, and there's lots of conclusions that we have. One is, this is very small writing here, first one, and these are 4 simple conclusions. First one, prayer spaces in schools do seem to contribute across the whole range of children's spiritual development. Across all the questionnaires, all the interviews, there was a lot of it about. We found it much easier than we might have thought to find examples of self-relationship, other people, the rest of the world, and the sacred and divine. Much, much more richer than when I've done lots of research on spirituality. It came much more easily in these prayer spaces than I might have expected. I hadn't been involved in prayer spaces. Second conclusion is the physicality of it all is important, the activity, the bubbles. I think people who've done them realise that, the going into the room and going, wow, the physical, the putting a bead. Did you know, by the way, the word bead means prayer. So prayer beads are just prayers. And actually a bead that's what the word is. The physicality of it all. The third one, that prayer spaces in schools are interpreted astonishingly differently by different children and by different adults, even in the same school. Small primary school I went to, the 4 adults and the 6 children, I think we probably got 8 or 9 completely different interpretations of what the prayer space was. One of the adults thought it was Christian and they'd like a Muslim prayer space and a Hindu prayer space. One thought it was an extension of an RE lesson. One thought it was a spiritual development area. Some of the children, within the same school. And you can't get away from that. It is whatever we think, or each of us thinks, it will be different from the children's and other adults' perspective. And finally, prayer spaces does raise controversial issues that should be tackled. As I say, tackled doesn't mean completely resolved, but tackled.
Yeah, so now we have time for any questions. And just before we take them and have a conversation about some of the things that we've discussed, you'll also see in the back of the interim report there is an accompanying questionnaire, which we would love for you to fill out, because again, this research is participatory, it is a dialogue, and any of your responses that you put in that questionnaire will actually then be included in the final report. So we'd really encourage you to fill that out and either give it to me and Julian directly.
Yeah.
Well, that would be the most ideal, but yeah, so if you could just give us the completed questionnaire form, that'd be great.
Thank you. What questions do you have?
Can I suggest that we just have
Yeah, I think that would be good.
10 minutes just with the people around us, what are immediate thoughts, questions, and then we'll...
Can you make them really difficult questions, please? I've just had a really strong coffee.
Just do that, sort of 3 or 4 minutes together with the people around us, what's really stuck out for you, what you're troubled about, what you deciphered by questions, comments, and then we'll pitch them to Julian and Rachel in a few minutes' time. Is that right? So just 3 or 4 minutes, a couple of people around here. So, I'm going to run around with the microphone so that we can capture the questions for the recording as well. Who's got a comment or a question? I knew it'd be someone right at the back. Dun, dun, dun,
Can you
dun.
make him run? So now someone right over here.
Go.
And then over.
Did you ask the students or teachers about, obviously prayer being something that possibly could impact on your life, so you may pray for something or ask for something. Was there any questions about sort of ongoing sort of change in the student's life, if that makes sense? So not just about how one feels, but has there been any sort of material change in their life through asking or praying?
No, not really. It depends which bit of that you mean. What we weren't doing, and we did talk about this, is working on the value or impact of prayer. We were asking them in their activities in prayer spaces in schools, these activities, Sanctum and the other names for them, who were they thinking about? What were their conversations like? What were they thinking? What were they saying in their heads? What were they saying with other people? Which was the best activity, the most valuable activity, and why? And what would they change if they could change it? So it included opportunities for them to say that, but we didn't say, so prayer, what did that? We didn't mention the word prayer at all.
No, so we didn't. Is that on here? So we didn't ask like what impact did prayer have on your life or outside of school. But naturally, if that did come up in the interviews, we would explore it. And sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But I do remember there was one respondent at a high school who said, prayer space actually helped me. I'm paraphrasing here, but helped me to identify or help me to recognise that I'm an agnostic, which I thought was really quite interesting.
That's a thought, though. It might be good to include the questionnaire questions somehow in the report for the future, because that might help people as well.
It'll be in the final one.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay.
I was just going to ask, across the 7 schools that you went into, was there kind of consistency over like how many times the pupils had entered the prayer space? Did they all deliver it in a similar way, or were there differences between the schools? How did you kind of...
I would say, so the schools that we sampled were those who had done prayer space. They may have done it more than once. And so in that way, some of them ended up reflecting on their most recent experience of prayer space, but it also might have been a prayer space they experienced a year or 2 before. So that was actually quite nice, added to the richness and diversity and nuanced nature of the data, in that prayer space by its nature was implemented and deployed differently in different settings, and also in terms of pupils' engagement with it as well.
And I would say we're going to do more work from the questionnaires as well, and all the transcripts on the difference patterning, where church schools different from non-church schools, where primary and secondary. My overall impression is that from the perspective of children, there was very little variation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
From the perspective of adults, there often was. The adults saw it differently in church and non-church schools more. The children tended to see it much the same in both. That's my impression, but we haven't done that bit yet. That's for the final report.
Hello. I was sort of thinking about your initial, how you set yourself up in dividing religious and non-religious. Certainly when I did some research, I spent some time explaining what the spiritual was, and in some ways it just discounted non-religious as don't know. Because I think there were various sort of descriptions within it, but in some ways it might have opened it up a bit. But actually finding the right readings to describe the spiritual was quite taxing. The children really enjoyed it. But I think with prayer spaces, you've started something here. And prayer is about entering into a relationship, isn't it? And in that sense, one of the things I would hope you'd take forward from your research is to get rid of your surprise that children were spiritual, because they're ahead of us. I'm absolutely convinced of this, having worked with them for 20 years, and really let them run with it. The adults will come behind. It's really exciting what you're opening here, and I think that's the way to do it. So in the same way we talk about pupil-led activities in school, I would let them lead this. I've certainly done it, and it's been wonderful where it's taken us. So be excited.
I would absolutely concur, and my book, The Spirit of the School from 2009, available in the foyer, it's not actually, but ask me, was saying that children have these spiritual and whatever, and both of us have confidence, and part that's why we wanted to work on this, that children's views are much stronger. I think much stronger, deeper, wider than a lot of adults give them credit for. I wasn't surprised by that because I've been doing research for a while. I think a lot of the adults in schools were surprised by that as a result of prayer spaces, and that saddens me because it should be happening in every lesson. It didn't surprise me in that sense, but what they actually said did surprise me, the particular range. The lack of a lot of prayer actually was a surprise to me. I thought prayer spaces in schools, and I didn't think everyone was going in kneeling down, and I knew it wasn't that, but still prayer was not a dominant theme, interestingly.
I find the report really encouraging, even in its interim state, just the variety of responses. I'm quite interested in as to whether you've had any conversations or research into the motivations of schools for inviting prayer spaces in, and also the groups which then serve that need, what they think they're doing, because there's so much surprise I hear, and that's the kind of the intentionality around it. That's what I'm interested in. So the school says, oh yes, prayer spaces come in. What do they think is happening? And what's the perspective as to whether it's of faith or of no faith or irreligious? And also, therefore, the groups that go in, what do they think they're doing that produces these surprises? That's the dynamic I'm interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we're working on is a paper for another conference on how the prayer spaces, well, the phrase I've used, and it's changed, is subversive obedience. There are laws that require schools to have collective worship. There are laws that require schools since 1944 to develop children spiritually. A lot of people in schools don't see that happening, and prayer spaces is a sort of subversive way of actually getting what is already statutory to actually happen. So it's a sort of oddly a subversiveness that is obedient to the law, if you see what I mean. So a lot of schools, it feels as though, are doing subversive obedience. Someone I think on the advisory group said, it's more than that, it's delegated subversive obedience. In other words, it's getting other people to do those risky things from outside, and you asked about the motivation, the relationship of outsiders, it's getting someone else to take that risk to do the things that the schools know they should be doing by statute, but they're not really doing, even in collective worship and whatever. And so there are those things going on which are really interesting about motivation.
Yeah, I mean, this is something we need to explore more fully in the final report, but certainly this relationship to the statutory requirements that are placed on primary and secondary schools in terms of the spiritual dimensions of school life and things like collective worship. I mean, my PhD's on collective worship, so I find it very interesting to see how schools saw this as part of their provision and meeting the legal requirement of collective worship, which can be seen as quite contested, quite controversial, and a lot of people question its suitability within, well, what is an increasingly plural and diverse society. But yeah, certainly attending to those motivations, and I like this idea of outsourcing sort of seeing prayer space as a way to outsource that part of the school day. But yeah, it's a really good question.
And those of you who work for outside organisations who are given a big welcome in schools realise you're given a big welcome in schools partly because, oh, thank goodness for that, someone else can, it's a relief welcome as well as a positive excitement welcome.
For the sake of time, we're going to do one more question, but as Julian and Rachel said, they're around for the day, so please grab them over lunch and ask them loads of questions. And I know that quite a few of you signed up for the session with them, the open conversation with them, but I'm just going to give you the mic. Final question.
You've raised some controversial issues. Were they quite themed? Were they regularly coming up, the same controversial issues, or were they wide and diverse? And what did it throw up?
I think broadly, even in one school, one person's controversy is another person's not controversy. So it never came up consistently across everyone in one setting or one group of people. One of the children, I found it really interesting, said they were quite annoyed because other children who were not religious were using prayer spaces and just pretending all of this stuff, and they shouldn't be doing it like that. And the person who was saying it was not religious and did find it interesting and valuable, but was upset at the boundary crossing of some of their fellow children. And that was a very subtle thing for a child to be worried about, but they were worried about the boundary crossing amongst their fellow pupils. So there was nothing clear-cut. You couldn't say, switch this off, switch this on, do this and it'll be all right. That's why I say, tackle these issues, don't expect to resolve them all. That would be my impression.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And can I remind people, there is a questionnaire here, and I did think if you don't want to pull apart this wonderful handout with a picture of me and Rachel on the last page, in order to fill this in and give in I've got some spare ones, so if people want a spare questionnaire. The question about your religion, including prefer not to stay and all of that, is the same categories as the children have. I'll be delighted to see your fill-in ones if you wish to do that. I love the ones that say, well, half Christian, half Muslim. And I wish they did, the children did, and all of that. So feel free and responsible as you are.
Julian, Rachel, on all of our behalf, thank you. Thank you very much for the work you've done. This is a gift to us. It's really helping us to understand some of what we're doing. And I think your point about listening, teachers listening, I think is the same for all of us. We need to learn to listen more. There's a reason, I believe, why Jesus makes a number of statements about children, one of them being, unless you become like a little child, how do you think you're going to enter the kingdom? How do you think you're going to see what you're supposed to see? And I don't think he was making a pithy statement. I think we've seen a little glimpse of that. What is it that children and young people see that we perhaps have unseen for various reasons? I want to see. And I think this is going to help us see some new things. So I'm really looking forward to the final report as well. Thank you for your work so far. We look forward to much more work to come.
Pesto that will stop us feeling lonely is waiting for us.
Brilliant. So Julian and Rachel would love some dinner conversation, some lunchtime conversation.